Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the new semester's series of VDEV that we are very happy to kick off with Imran Rasul, who will be talking about his work in Uganda. But before giving the floor to Imran, and as other people are logging in, let me remind you of the rules of the game here, although many of you are not familiar with this. But for those who aren't, so we have the 60 minutes of presentation by Imran, during which you can, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring those questions and at a few key points during the presentation, ask questions that are good to clarify at that point. And then after the 60 minutes, there will be 15 minutes of open mic Q&A. So then if you have questions that you want to ask live, or if you have further discussions, that's the moment, and we very much invite you to participate in that too. If there are questions that you type in the Q&A that we can't get to during the first hour, don't get upset. You know, we have part of this could be that it's because we have seen Imran's slides, and so if there are things that he'll address later on, we'll just wait for that. And partly, of course, it could be that there's too many questions. We can't get to them all, but remember that you'll have an opportunity to ask your question live afterwards. If you, and so at that point, if you raise your hands, we'll unmute for the questions. The seminar is being recorded and is being placed on the YouTube channel. So if you want to tell others about this, please do, and it's going to be available for a little bit afterwards. And for those of you who are new, so this is a kind of a bi-weekly seminar. So we'll be here again in 2 weeks with the next speaker, and the full schedule for the spring semester is on the website. And then finally, I don't need to say this, but just in case, of course, abuse will not be tolerated. And so with that, Imran, I'm very happy to have you with us and very excited to hear about this paper. The floor is all yours.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to all the organizers for inviting me here today. Hopefully you can see the slides just fine. And so the paper I'm going to present today is joint work with a sort of a large number of co-authors. It's kind of a usual team that I've been working with. The one person I should highlight is Vitali, who's a student of mine at UCL, who's going to be on the job market in about a year's time. So you should definitely keep an eye out for her if you're interested in hiring somebody working at the intersection between development and IO. So the motivation for this paper is that, you know, there's a large number of individuals throughout Africa who are either unemployed or underemployed. And so at the top of the policy agenda in many countries throughout that region and elsewhere is this pressing need to find large cohorts of young labour market entrants, sort of good jobs, as they make that transition from schooling into the labour market. That's certainly the case in our study context that I'll be talking about today, which is Uganda, which has a very skewed population pyramid structure, so that about 80% of the population is aged 25 and below. And so there are these very large cohorts of young people entering the labour market in search of good employment. Now, in order to understand sort of the fundamentals of labour markets in these contexts, sort of the key labour market frictions that we perceive are of the following three types. And sort of the field experiment that I'll be describing is explicitly designed to try to relax some of these. The first is that there may be skills mismatch, that the skills that labour market entrants have are simply not those demanded by firms, and that may be partly because of an inadequacy of the education system. The second key constraint are related to sort of credit constraints that mean that even if individuals know which skills are going to be demanded by firms, they have an inability to invest in those types of human capital post-labour market entry. And the third key friction we're going to emphasize throughout are those related to information, where both workers and firms may be imperfectly informed about the other side of the market. And so as a result, in a combination of these kinds of frictions, what we typically observe in these types of labour markets is that young people, when they first enter these labour markets, are very much reliant on casual itinerant work And there's just a very slow transition up to the job ladder into more formal and regular types of employment. What we're going to do in this paper is set out a field experiment that's designed to answer a very simple, straightforward question, which is exactly how do workers search for jobs in urban labour markets. Now, study context will be 15 different urban labour markets throughout Uganda, including Kampala. We're going to try to answer this question using a sort of a long-term field experiment. It's going to run over 6 years, where we're going to track young people as they first enter the labour market, close to our baseline, and their subsequent career histories over the next 6 years. We really want to use that time frame to understand the sort of the deep mechanics of the job search process in which they're engaged. And we want to try to understand that through the provision of 2 standard type of labour market interventions here. One is going to be the offer of vocational training to some of these individuals. So fundamentally relaxing credit constraints for these individuals, allowing them to acquire skills that are valued in these labour markets. Second treatment arm will be the offer of vocational training, same as above, but in addition, we'll offer to match workers to firms in the attempt to reduce search frictions between supply and demand in these labour markets. And the third treatment arm will be just only the offer of matching between workers and firms. And so in this paper, given we've got 6 years, we're going to combine that with sort of very detailed measurement to build up a very granular picture of this job search process. So the causal chain that I'm going to sort of try to talk through in the next 55 minutes or so is the following. We're going to expose workers to the randomized offer of these types of interventions that relate to very standard, very common labour market interventions related to the provision of skills and trying to match workers to firms. We're going to then document how that impacts workers, primarily in terms of the expectations that they then have about the returns to their own ability, how that's then going to drive forward endogenous changes in how they're searching for jobs. And then we'll come to look at whether the changes in search behavior as experimentally induced by these interventions does actually have sort of persistent long-run labour market impacts on them in terms of where they end up to 6 years later. And so throughout the analysis, we're really going to emphasize the foundational role that worker expectations have for understanding this process and the long-run outcomes for workers. And there'll be 2 margins of expectations we'll really focus in on. The first is, what do workers believe is the job offer arrival rate from firms in good sectors? And I'll be more precise about what I mean by good sectors in a little while. So that's one key margin, the arrival rate of job offers from these types of good firms. And the second key margin we'll study is, what do workers expect earnings to be conditional on them being employed in a good sector? And we look at the evolution of those beliefs over time as a function of these treatments, how that changes their search behavior subsequently, and then ultimately, you know, how does that impact their long-run outcomes? So the types of underpinning job search behavior we'll look at is the intensity of search, and we'll have a number of different margins of how we're going to measure the intensity of search, some of which have been studied in the earlier literature. We'll also present direct results on whether the change in expectations then drives directed search, whether workers tailor their search to look for particular jobs, particular firms, and therefore potentially impacts sorting in the labour market. And the labour market outcomes that I'll show you, there's a long list of them. I'll just highlight 2 classes of labour market outcomes we'll talk about. One class are going to be things that you'd expect me to show in terms of employment and earnings, though those are kind of like standard labour market outcomes that we're interested in. But we'll also have some more detailed evidence looking at sorting in the labour market in terms of the job and firm characteristics that these workers actually end up matched to, as well as impacts on job spells, unemployment spells, and other forms of labour market dynamics. So that's going to be sort of the rich picture that I'll try to build up from start to finish over the presentation. So let me get into the design of the field experiment and tell you a little bit more about each of these treatment arms and how they're impacting expectations. So this is an oversubscription design where we advertise throughout Uganda the possibility of individuals to receive vocational training. We didn't have funding for everybody to receive vocational training, and the intervention was targeted towards disadvantaged youth. So these are sort of not randomly selected job seekers in Uganda. They're young individuals, but some of the criteria cause them to have even worse labour market histories than the average youth who's searching for jobs in these labour markets. So we start with about 1,400 eligible applications, and then workers are assigned into treatment arms through the following sort of two-stage process. The first stage is that a subset of workers are randomly assigned to receive vocational training, and a random group are then assigned not to receive that vocational training. And I'll describe what I mean by vocational training in a few slides' time. That's essentially going to be 6 months of intense sector-specific training that will provide these young individuals close to a sector in which they expressed a preference that they would like to be trained in. Those sectors are going to correspond to both manufacturing and service sectors, and that's what I mean by good jobs. We're going to focus in on essentially 8 different sectors in the economy, which are typically associated with high-wage, high-productivity firms. A quarter of young people who are employed in Uganda are employed in one of these 8 sectors. So these are the types of jobs that the individuals want, and that's what we're going to be training individuals in. So examples of these sectors are working in construction, in plumbing, in electrical wiring, in catering, in hairdressing, and so on and so forth. So these are relatively good jobs for this economy, and very different from the types of casual work that these individuals are normally reliant on pre-intervention. Then the second stage of randomization will be at the end of vocational training. There'll be one group of workers, the T1 group, who then, upon graduation from the Vocational Training Institute 6 months later, will then go and just search for jobs in the normal fashion. Vocational Training Institute's role is to train the workers, it's not to find them jobs. So that first treatment arm is essentially business as usual, where workers, having acquired these skills, then go and search for jobs in the natural, using the natural process. The second treatment arm will be amongst workers who are graduating. A random subset will be offered to potentially match with firms who are working in the same sector in which they've just been trained and are geographically close to the worker to increase the feasibility of the match. And amongst workers who are randomly assigned not to receive the vocational training, there'll be a group of workers who are held out as controls, and a group of workers who at the same time when the vocational trainees are graduating, we'll go back to them and we'll offer them the potential match with firms operating in a sector in which they would have liked to have been trained, but they were randomized out of that training, and again, operating in sort of the same geographic location as the individual. Lots of potential pairwise comparisons that we can look at. The ones that we'll focus on in this paper are the comparison between T1 and the control group. So what's the causal impact of the offer of vocational training on how workers are searching? So how does search behavior change as workers essentially acquire more skills? Then the difference between T1 and T2, what is the differential impact on search if we also additionally offer workers the possibility to match just as they're entering the labor market and meeting firms for the first time? And the third comparison we'll talk a little bit about is between T3 and the controls. Amongst that subset of workers who are lower down the skills distribution, these are essentially unskilled workers, what is the impact of offering to match them to firms on their search behavior, and does that have long-run impacts on their labor market outcomes? So that's essentially the structure of the intervention. Just to give you some kind of context of what our sort of labor market entrants look like, on average, they're aged about 20. There's an equal split between men and women. Unemployment rates for these individuals at baseline are close to 60%. And you can see amongst those who are engaged in some type of income generating activity, most of them are reliant on casual work rather than regular wage employment. Very few of them are engaged in self-employment. Earnings are very low. The value of the vocational training that we're providing is about $450 US. This is not the type of investment in human capital these workers could typically achieve. And when we're looking at labor market outcomes in the last third of the paper, we'll look not just at what happens to their employment rates, but in particular, we're going to look at this transition, whether they move away from the reliance on casual work towards more regular work, and that transition up the job ladder, and how that is impacted differentially depending on whether they were just acquired skills with the additional help of a match, or were just given the match conditional on not being offered the skills. Okay, so let me talk about those treatment norms in slightly more detail. They are fairly standard, sort of off-the-shelf interventions. There's been many sort of meta-analyses of these types of interventions, but let me be very precise about exactly what we're doing here. So the vocational training is provided by pre-existing vocational training institutes throughout Uganda. This is not training that we sort of designed. These are sort of off-the-shelf curricula that would normally be provided by these typically private sector VTIs. So this is very much a business as usual model of private training provision. It's something that could be scaled up to some extent. Each of the training courses is intense. It's 6 months. This is not light touch sort of changes in human capital. And workers at baseline, they express sort of a preference ranking over which sector they would like to be trained in. The vast majority get one of their top 2 sectors and are actually assigned to those classes for 6 months. The training courses that we offer are one of 8 types. And as I said, those are all associated with sectors that typically have regular work, formal work, high productivity, high wages in those types of sectors. They span both manufacturing and service sectors along the lines that I mentioned before. The cost of this intervention is first order. It's about $470 per trainee, clearly relaxing credit constraints from allowing workers to invest in human capital relative to the control group. So this is not the kind of investment they could typically undertake absent the intervention. The second treatment arm are the match offers. Okay, so this is simply a very light touch, very short-term intervention that we conducted for workers to offer to match these workers to firms. And this was done in a very uniform way, both for skilled workers and unskilled workers. We use scripts that are sort of presented in the paper. So these matches are offered both to those who are just at the point of graduating the vocational training, as well as those who are randomized out of the vocational training. The match offers are only announced to take place to the workers just on the eve at which they're going to take place. So it's not that workers, when they're first assigned to the vocational training, know that they're later going to receive this match offer or not. That's somewhat of a surprise to them at the end of the vocational training. That's going to be important for some of the interpretation here. Naturally, all workers are very keen for their details to be passed on to firms in this way. So there's a near 100% take-up of workers. And the way these match offers work is that we take the worker, we put their CV into a standard anonymized format, and then we present that CV to some of the firms who are operating in the sectors in which they've been trained, as well as in the same region in which the worker is located. So the firms essentially get to see some basic X's of the worker, including whether they've been trained, whether they've been through a vocational training institute, and exactly what they've been trained in. So this is a stratified worker firm match by sector and location. The firms don't have the individual contact details of the workers. If they want to call back the worker for an interview, they need to come through us as the experimenters. And so we have good information about the extent to which firms are interested in meeting with these workers or not. And typically, each firm is going to be matched to 2 workers. Those workers will always come from the same treatment arm. So a firm will only be matched with 2 workers. Either both of those workers have received vocational training and they're both skilled, or neither of them have received the offer of vocational training. And from the workers' perspective, they're typically going to be matched to 1 or 2 firms. They're going to be matched to a small number of firms. That's what they're told in these scripts. And so this is a very small share of all firms that are operating in that sector in their region. It's a light touch process. It's merely the offer of passing on your details, your CV, onto one of these firm owners. And so the entire process, from when we first tell workers, do you want your CV to be passed on, to the point when firms start contacting workers, inviting them for interview, takes about 2 weeks. And that's what the match offer treatment is. And we want to try to understand whether that type of assistance over and above vocational training helps or hinders workers in terms of how they're searching and their subsequent long-run labor market outcomes. So maybe I should just pause there before I talk about the timeline, in case there's any questions about the specifics of the treatments.
There's a quick question on characterization of the population. So what is the education levels of the people, and also how many? And the other question, or 2 questions which are related, is for the vocational training, what's the take-up, both the initial take-up and then the finishing of the training?
So for the vocational training, the take-up rates are about 65%. conditional on starting the training, 99% of workers complete the training because we pay all of their out-of-pocket costs. So the selection into training is identical between those workers in the vocational training arm and the vocational training plus matching arm. So that comparison, even if there is some non-random selection into take-up, that's going to be a valid comparison that I'll focus on throughout. In terms of the education of these workers, they're typically past primary education, but not much further. That was one of the eligibility criteria. So think of these as being particularly unskilled, low-educated youth who are searching for jobs. So they're kind of negatively selected amongst the pool of unemployed individuals in Uganda.
And then another question on the supply side. So did you target firms that for which you already knew they had offers to make and sufficient offers for all the trainees, or that's part of what you're looking at?
No, so so firms were not selected into the sample based on a vacancy. The vast majority of them report having a vacancy when we started the study at baseline. 6 months later, once we start offering workers to them, that situation may have changed. Labour demand fluctuates quite a lot. There's a lot of turnover in these firms, and that's going to turn out to be a key constraint for some of the impacts in terms of the ultimate demand these firms have for these workers. And I can talk about thought experiments of what you could do if you could relax that constraint a little bit later. But firms are not selected on the basis of having a vacancy necessarily.
I'll let you continue.
The 6-year study timeline can be essentially divided up into sort of 3 phases. And these are going to be the 3 steps of analysis that we'll do. So workers were initially recruited into the sample in 2012. Then for those who are assigned to vocational training, we're going to interview them at the end of their vocational training, but before they know anything about match offers. So that's going to allow us to say a little bit about the evolution of beliefs that these workers have just from the provision of vocational training, but prior to them knowing about the existence of any match offers. Then the matching interventions will take place. And then we'll look at search behaviors and expectations subsequent to that for a year after the workers have graduated from vocational training and all the match offers have taken place. So for the full year afterwards, they're now searching for jobs in the normal way, perhaps with more skills, perhaps with that initial match offer. We'll look at what happens to their evolution of beliefs over that 1-year period post-intervention and how that subsequently changes their search behaviors. And then to look at labour market outcomes in the long run, we'll focus in on the last 3 survey ways, which will document impacts up to 6 years after we first interviewed the workers at baseline, up to about 55 months after they received the training and the matching intervention. Remember, the matching interventions themselves only last 2 weeks. We don't think any of our results are driven by workers substituting their effort away in any way from the normal period of search. But it's going to be important to understand whether these very temporary interventions in terms of matching do end up having persistent impacts on workers, and exactly what's the mechanism for that. Okay, so what's really key here is understanding what workers' expectations are. So let me try to build up this picture to understand how workers might react to these interventions in terms of their expectations. So I'm going to do that in sort of 4 steps. First of all, I'm just going to talk about the control group and talk about their expectations relative to reality, and show you the dimensions along which workers seem to have biased beliefs and which dimensions they seem to have fairly accurate beliefs. Then I'll zoom in on that period between baseline and just the eve of match offers being announced to then describe what's happening to the expectation of those workers that were assigned to vocational training. Then I'll talk about what happens in the match offers, and then we can understand, given we know something about the evolution of their beliefs, how they may actually respond to callback subsequently. So they're the 4 steps I really want to go through to sort of lay the foundations of why we think workers are being impacted differentially by these treatments. And then we'll look at hard outcomes in terms of their search behaviors and long-run labour market outcomes. So let's just focus in on the control group. So the first margin of expectation I want to show you is what do they believe is the expected job offer arrival rate from firms in these good sectors. This is measured for the control workers at baseline. And we asked them over 3 different time horizons, what do you think is the likelihood that you're going to get a job offer from one of these firms, either in the next month, in the next 6 months, or the next 12 months? Conditional on a worker getting a job offer, acceptance rates are close to 1. So just think of this as sort of a job offer arrival rate. And what I'm showing here is a box and whisker plot that's essentially showing you the entire distribution of their beliefs over those time horizons. So this middle bar here is the median belief held by workers, by control workers. Sort of the big block here is the interquartile range. And then I think we've got the 10th and the 90th percentiles indicate that. So this is like the full span of data that we have. So 2 points to note. First is that as we ask workers this question over a longer time horizon, they do think the likelihood of a job offer coming from one of these good sectors is increasing over time. So in that sense, they've kind of understood the question. We've enlisted sort of both low and high probabilities and probabilities that are monotonic over the time period in which we're asking. But a question might be, how realistic are these beliefs? And there we can sort of match up what workers are responding to in our survey with a household survey that was conducted in Uganda at pretty much the same time, the Uganda National Household Survey. And there we find the actual employment rates in these 8 good sectors for unskilled youth that are very similar in terms of X's as our sample is around about 20%. And yet our sample believe that in the next 12 months, the median worker thinks that they're going to receive a job offer with a probability of 0.6. So on that margin, relative to a benchmark of 0.2, they seem to be over-optimistic on the job offer arrival rate. Relative to what we actually observe in large-scale survey data, these workers actually, the rate at which they're actually employed in these types of firms. Now, a question might be, well, are they learning the truth relatively quickly? So there we can follow these workers for another year. So, sorry, 2 years later is our first follow-up. And so amongst the control workers, you've seen over each time horizon, they've revised down their beliefs. Okay, so they're not as optimistic, our control workers, 2 years later, once they've been searching for jobs over time. Remember, their baseline unemployment rate was close to 60%. That doesn't change much over the first 2 years. They gradually start to learn, we're not going to receive these job offers from these good sector firms. And this is the degree to which they revise their beliefs at any given time period, as measured 2 years later. And given that we actually then survey these control workers again at second follow-up, exactly over this time horizon, these last 3 sets of bars show you in actuality what were the actual rates of these workers transitioning into a good sector job, either over the next month, over the next 6 months, or actually over the next year. So you can see that at baseline, they thought that was going to happen probability 0.6. 2 years later, they're becoming gradually more realistic and say it's 0.4, but they're still pretty optimistic relative to what actually occurs, which is that about 11 or 12% of them actually find jobs in these good sectors. Okay, so first result is that on the job offer arrival rate, these workers tend to be over-optimistic at baseline. They do learn over time, but only very, very gradually. There's persistent optimism on the job offer arrival rate amongst our sample. The other margin that we look at is sort of what do they believe are the expected earnings conditional on them actually being employed in one of these good firms. Okay, now to set a benchmark for this, the first 2 bars just show you the distribution of earnings that they've currently experienced at baseline in either casual employment or regular employment. As you might expect, regular employment has a slightly higher distribution than for casual employment. The median worker, when they're casually employed, is not being paid anything. They're kind of being paid almost in kind. But then when we ask them, if you were to get a job in one of these 8 good sectors, what do you think would be your minimum earnings? What would be your maximum earnings? So they recognize that these jobs are better than the types of regular employment they've currently experienced up until baseline. We can fit a triangular distribution to their beliefs to form a distribution of the expected earnings that they think that they'll get in these good jobs. So they understand there's a wage premium if they move into these good jobs. Are these beliefs realistic or not? Well, there we can go to the firms that we're working with in this study. We actually know amongst those firms in these sectors what their workers are being paid. And this is the actual distribution of earnings of workers in firms in these good sectors, either workers who are unskilled or workers who are recent hires. You might think of those as being the most valid counterfactual for workers in our control group. And so the relevant comparison between their beliefs and actuality is sort of in this red dash box. So on this margin, their beliefs are not too inaccurate. In fact, there's a large overlap between what they expect the earnings to be, conditional on them being employed in these sectors, and what we actually see workers in those firms receiving. The second result is that, you know, workers actually do have good information about the earnings distribution conditional on getting one of these jobs. Where they're completely over optimistic is on the likelihood that they're going to receive one of these job offers. And that's going to be important for interpreting what happens in the in response to the match offer treatments. So now let me zoom in on the first 6 months of our study and show you what's happening to the beliefs of those workers that we randomly assigned to vocational training relative to the control group. Okay, so the control group I've shown you start optimistic and gradually become more realistic over time. Okay, so this is just the same information I've just shown you, but now just done at baseline and then 6 months later. So this just shows you what I previously showed you over a 2-year time horizon, that control workers are gradually becoming more realistic about the job offer arrival rate. What's happening to vocational trainees though, and this is, we're going to survey vocational trainees just as they're graduating from their course, their 6-month course, but before they know anything about the match offers coming into existence. And so what you see here is that for vocational trainees, their beliefs about the job offer arrival rate is going in completely the opposite direction. If we look, for example, if we just focus in on what the trainees believe is going to be the distribution of job offer arrival rates at a 1-year time horizon, you see that amongst those workers at the point when they're completing training, the median worker thinks they're going to receive a job offer in a good sector with probability 0.9. 25% of them believe this is going to occur with probability 1. All of these workers, these two treatment arms, are identical at baseline, but because some are assigned to vocational training and some are held as controls, there's a complete bifurcation in their beliefs. There's almost no overlap at all in the interquartile range of their beliefs between those who are assigned to vocational training relative to those who are assigned away from vocational training and don't receive that intervention. So there's a complete sort of split in their beliefs. So the natural question to ask is, well, we would normally expect individuals who are skilled to receive job offers at a higher rate. So the direction of change is not that surprising, but is the magnitude of change getting them closer or further away from reality? Again, we can go back to the nationally representative household survey, and there we find employment rates for skilled youth in that sample, in our 8 good sectors, rises from 20% for unskilled guys to 35% for skilled guys. So if anything, our skilled workers are becoming even more exuberant, even more optimistic relative to the truth. They think the returns to being skilled in terms of the job offer arrival rate is far higher than it actually is, as evidenced by the household survey. So not only are their beliefs moving in a different direction than the control group, but they're also becoming even more optimistic just on the eve of match offers being announced. Then we, in terms of their beliefs about the earnings distribution, they're quite accurate in terms of what they believe the earnings returns will be to being skilled. They expect their earnings conditional on being employed in a good sector to rise by about 40%. In our earlier work, we've used sort of experimental and structural estimates to actually quantify the returns to skills in this economy to be about 20 to 30%. So they become slightly more optimistic even on that margin as well. But the first order degree of sort of behavioral bias here is in terms of their beliefs about the job offer arrival rate, which are far more optimistic than we expect to be the case given sort of the survey data that we have. Okay, so just before match offers are announced, we've got these two groups. We've got increasingly realistic controls who are revising down their beliefs and realizing the world isn't going to be that great, versus these trainees who are increasingly euphoric in terms of the job offer arrival rate. Then for both of these two groups, we take the skilled and the unskilled workers and a random subset of them, we offer them their details to be passed on to a firm operating in the same sector in which they've just been trained or in which they desired to be trained, and all of them want their details to be passed on. okay, in that sort of light touch, short-term match offer treatment. And so from the worker's perspective, the key outcome from the match offers is whether they receive a call back from the owner of the firm inviting them to interview. So there, in terms of how they're going to react to that, we want to compare what they expected, sort of the match offer, sort of the arrival rate of job offers to be relative to what were the actual callback rates. Okay, and we do this over a sort of a 1 month time horizon. And so for skilled workers, the median skilled worker at the end of graduation thought there was a 30% chance they would receive a job offer from one of these good sector firms in the next month. The actual rate of callbacks when we present their CV to these firm owners is less than half of that. For the average and for the median skilled worker, this can represent somewhat a downward revision in their beliefs. For unskilled workers, remember, they were revising down their beliefs just naturally through the natural process of search. Amongst them, the median worker thought that in the next month, they would receive a job offer from one of these good sector firms with probability 0.15, and the actual rate of callbacks in the experiment from firm owners is pretty much in line with that, about 0.19. So why are callbacks rates so low? This kind of surprised us. And the reason for that is that I think, as Karen was mentioning before, these firms simply lack vacancies at the point in which we actually make the match offer. Many of them report having a vacancy at baseline, but by the time we implement the treatments and we come back to the firms, very few of them actually have vacancies at that point. And so what predicts callback rates, the number one predictor, is whether the firm says they have a vacancy at that point. The lack of callbacks is nothing to do with the workers. Individual worker characteristics don't predict whether a worker gets called back or not. And that's almost by design, it's almost by construction. Remember, the information that firms have about the workers is either you have 2 skilled workers or 2 unskilled workers. By design, the X's of these workers are designed to be almost the same. There's no basis on which to prefer one worker over the other worker. And so individual characteristics have no predictive power about whether workers receive a callback or not. It's purely driven by firm characteristics. Okay, this is almost like the opposite of an audit study. In an audit study, what you would do is keep all the X's except one constant, experimentally manipulate that one X to make sure that X was particularly salient in firms' decision-making. Here we're doing the opposite. All the X's are the same. That's why worker characteristics don't predict callback rates. They're nothing to do with the worker. They're just determined by whether the firm happens to have a vacancy at that particular moment in time. But whether workers understand that or not, it's going to be key to understanding what happens to their subsequent expectations and search behavior. The null is that workers kind of understand that. They get that. If they don't get a callback, from the way the experiment's been explained to them, they know that their details have been passed on to a small number of firms. It's typically like 1 or 2 firms. We estimate the market size for firms here to be about 40 in each of these sectors by region. There's really no informational content from getting a lack of a callback from one particular firm. Workers should just ignore that information. It shouldn't really affect their posterior beliefs about their own future selves. The alternative hypothesis is that the workers might be imperfectly informed and they might misattribute the lack of callback as actually being informative of their job prospects. They may overreact to one particular bad signal, somewhat like job candidates sometimes do on the job market, that we think there's no particular signal in one particular offer, but sometimes people can get encouraged or discouraged based on that one particular signal that they receive. Why might that be plausible here? Well, I showed you that workers actually have biased beliefs to begin with. It's not that they're fully informed to start with. And this match offer, there's no market substitutes for it. And in a sort of a labor market that's characterized by informal search, where workers are typically trying to approach firm owners directly, what the match offer might be doing is essentially saying to workers, look, we're going to guarantee that your CV gets under the nose of a firm owner. That's a hard thing for you to do outside the experiment. And so if you don't get a call back, even in that state of the world, you may actually think, things are actually much worse for me than I otherwise would have predicted, even though there's no reason to update your posterior beliefs based on just the actions of one particular or one or two firm particular owners. Okay, so under the null, workers' expectations and search behavior shouldn't be affected by the lack of callbacks. Under the alternative, they could be. And so if we view the world in terms of that null and that alternative, amongst those who were offered vocational training and then subsequently were offered matching, on average, the low callback rates are going to represent bad news for those workers. And so that's going to help us to isolate, does that bad news have permanent impacts on how they're searching relative to those workers who just received the vocational training and didn't receive any signals from this match offer treatment? And amongst those who randomize out of vocational training, essentially the signal they receive from the lack of callbacks is pretty much spot on. It's just confirming to them that jobs are going to be pretty hard to find. What do they do in response to that? That's going to be an empirical question that we now come to. Okay, so that's essentially the setup, that workers' beliefs here are going to be critical. The evolution of their beliefs up until the match offers are very different, depending on whether they're assigned to vocational training or not, and how they might respond to the lack of callbacks might also depend on some of these factors. So we're going to think of this as do we find any evidence of workers' expectations changing? That will be in line with them being imperfectly informed, misattributing the negative, the lack of callback, saying something about them, changing their search behaviors as a result that might then have persistent impacts on the labor market outcomes. Okay, so now I can move to
kind of a couple of questions on the expectation side. So there's a question by David Bernard on whether the expectations were the forecast for the employment and wages was incentivized, and if not, so are you not worried about experimental demand effects in that case?
Those should be common across the different treatment groups, treatment arms, and in addition, workers do report accurate estimates about the wage offer distribution. It's just on one rather than the other margin that they seem to be ill-informed.
And then a question from Noreen Karichawala, do you have expectations on their ability? So like, do they, in addition to kind of expectations on whether they'll get a job, do they have an expectation on whether they actually learn something?
No. We do have questions at the end of the vocational training, whether they thought the training was useful, and some of those questions specifically related to the training, and all those margins move forward. But in terms of expectations, we debated this long and hard. Trying to elicit expectations about the returns to your own ability are somewhat vague. And we think of this as being a good proxy for thinking about what they think of as the expected returns to their own skill set. I mean, that's exactly how the questions are worded. There's one other class of expectations that I'll come to, which is what do they believe about the labor market as a whole? Because one alternative interpretation is they're not updating their beliefs about their own skills. What they're doing is updating their beliefs about the state of the labor market as a whole. And I'll disentangle those two, and I'll show you some evidence that they don't revise their beliefs at all about labor market conditions. They revise dramatically their beliefs about their own sort of return to their own skills in terms of these two margins.
And then there is a couple of questions that touch on the issue of what you do with people that have jobs, because for them, I guess the
exact wording of the question is: imagine that you lost your job, then what would be these livelihoods of these? Yeah. So the exact wording is sort of worked out and it's shown in the paper. But for everybody, we elicit these beliefs, and so we don't think there's selection condition on you having been employed already. Okay, so now I'm going to get into sort of phase 2 of the experiment, which is a year after workers graduated, a year after these match offers were implemented. What's happened to these workers in terms of their expectations, and is that changing their underlying search behaviors? This is a year after, so they've had a long period of time over which to search naturally, depending on their labor market histories. Just one small footnote here. We look at whether the workers' skills have changed. Worker sector-specific skills have significantly improved if they've been assigned to the vocational training, but there's no differential impact on skills between those who were assigned to vocational training and those who were later also given the match offer. That's not surprising because the match offer was only announced at the end of the vocational training. So when I'm comparing vocational trainees with and without the match, I'm comparing two groups of workers with identical human capital. Both of them have more skills relative to the control group, but the same skills relative to each other. So these two workers should ultimately, if the economy is operating efficiently, be matched to similar types of firms and have similar types of labor market outcomes. The extent to which they don't is being driven by how they're responding to the match offer treatment, the pure signal, the pure information friction that's being generated from that. Okay, so what happens to their beliefs a year after the interventions end? So if we look at the job offer arrival rate, these are just all intent to treat impacts. So not worrying about sort of differential selection into vocational training. There are some observable characteristics that predict that, but that's the same between the first two treatment arms. And so this is a year later, we're seeing that vocational trainees have revised upwards persistently their belief about the job offer arrival rate. For those workers who are equally skilled, but a year earlier were also offered this match assistance, which for the average worker amongst that group represented bad news given the lack of callbacks. What we're seeing is that they are responding to that in terms of their long-run beliefs. They are revising up their beliefs about the job offer arrival rate relative to the control group, but there's a significant difference in their beliefs on that margin relative to workers who were equally skilled, but weren't additionally offered this match offer. There is a persistent difference in their beliefs that they hold up to a year later between the vocational trainees with and without the match. That also extends to their expected earnings conditional on employment. And let me focus here on sort of the minimum earnings that they'd expect conditional on being employed in one of these good sectors. The reason why I'm focusing on that is that in many job search models, that's going to be proportional to their reservation wage. Okay, that's going to be the minimum that they would expect. No employer is going to offer them a wage below that and get them to reject with probability 1. And so here, in terms of this proxy for their reservation wage, you're seeing that relative to the control group, both groups of trainees are significantly revising up their reservation wage. That's what we'd expect. But again, a year later, there's a significant difference in the minimum expected earnings they expect between those who've just been vocationally trained versus those who've been vocationally trained, have the same skills, but in addition were exposed to the match offer treatments. Okay, and that kind of pattern follows through on some of these other margins, so that overall, the match offer trainees, the individuals who receive both vocational training and matching, have significantly different beliefs on these important margins relative to workers who are equally skilled, but weren't given the match offer treatment. One way to interpret this is these workers have become slightly discouraged. And that's because on average, they're receiving bad news relative to their prior from the match offer. They're not revising their beliefs up to the same extent as is purely driven by the acquisition of skills. That's being tempered a little bit because we're hitting them with this bad news just at the point when they're transitioning into the labor market, meeting employers for the first time, and that effect is persisting up to a year later. Now, an alternative interpretation is that rather than these workers becoming discouraged, they might be changing their beliefs about labor market conditions as a whole. So that was the other group of expectations that we asked workers, whether they think the lack of firms is a serious problem, blah, 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 all of these other things. So this is just all summarized in a market beliefs index. We find no evidence that workers are changing their beliefs about market conditions as a whole. They're responding to the match offer treatment by changing their beliefs about their own job prospects. And that's differential between the vocational trainees with and without matching. Okay, so does any of this actually change their behavior? Okay, so what are the underlying search behaviors that are then being changed? Okay, and so now we've got the change in their expectations a year later. We've also got many different margins of search behavior that we can look at. Let me just highlight a few of those. The first that you'd want to look at is sort of how hard are they searching for jobs? You might think that the change in their belief about the job offer arrival rate then is telling us something that they believe the returns to search have changed. Okay. Now, whether they're searching more or less is ambiguous because there's going to be both income and substitution effects of the returns to search having changed, given that they've acquired skills and potentially been hit by this shock. So there's no unambiguous prediction there on the sign of the effect, but we can just let the data tell us what's going on. So sort of the crudest way to look at search intensity is whether they've actively looked for a job in the last year. And there you see, again, there's a significant difference between what vocational trainees are reporting relative to vocational trainees that are additionally assisted with the match offer. Those who are additionally assisted with the match offer, if that represents bad news for them on average, they're less likely to be searching on the extensive margin relative to workers who are equally skilled, but weren't given that match offer. Okay. So in that sense, what we're finding evidence of is that skills and search intensity are complements on the extensive margin. Having more skills causes workers to actually search more on the extensive margin, but that effect is tempered for workers who, in addition, are given these match offers. Okay, there's a number of different other margins of search intensity that we look at in terms of whether workers are searching over a wider geographic area, whether they're changing their channels of search. Those are all impacted by skills, but the interaction between skills and the match offers is much weaker on those margins of search intensity. The main margin at which matching seems to be making a difference for skilled workers is in terms of the extensive margin of whether they're actively looking for work in the first place at all. And that might be the most important margin relative to some of these other margins. The other dimension of search that we're interested in is whether workers start engaging in directed search, whether they start looking for particular firms and particular jobs in response to the treatments that we provided. And there we're finding, in terms of directed search, those workers who have provided vocational training, we ask them, what are the characteristics of firms that you're searching for? We ask them that on a number of different dimensions. We then sort of combine those to get an index of firm quality, where this index is increasing in firm quality. And so what we find is that workers who received the offer of vocational training relative to the control group are also searching for significantly higher quality firms. That is much weaker amongst workers who've got the same set of skills, but in addition were given the match offer treatments. The difference between those two groups is really driven by the fact that workers who are only offered vocational training are significantly more likely to say we're searching for larger firms and we're searching for firms that are registered or more formal or that issue contracts. So the change in expectations is changing how hard these workers are searching, but it's also changing the types of firms they're trying to match with. So it's potentially affecting sorting in the labor market as well. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the match only workers here. We don't find any evidence that they change the types of jobs that they're searching for, but they do change the type of firm that they're searching for. Okay, so just to summarize, we do find significant differences in expectations and underlying job search behaviors when we compare the vocational trainees with and without the match offer. Remember, these two groups have the same set of skills, but one group, when they're hit by the bad news from the match offer, that changes their expectations, both in terms of what they believe that the job offer arrival rate is going to be. They revise their reservation wage to a lesser extent. They search less intensely, and they search for worse quality firms. Okay, so all of those expectations and search behaviors are impacted differentially by this very light touch job match assistance offer. And so in the last part of the talk, for the next 10 minutes, I want to see, does any of this matter for long run outcomes? It may be the case that, they get off to a bad start, but eventually they're going to get up the job ladder, and 6 years later, there's no difference for them. Are there going to be persistent effects of this type of match offer treatment? And remember, I just want to reiterate again, these two groups of workers have identical skills, okay, at least at the point when they're graduating from vocational training. And so we would expect them to ultimately match to the same types of firms. Whether that's the case or not depends on whether these changes in beliefs and search strategy are having permanent impacts on the types of work that they're finding. So now I'm going to come to phase 3, where I'm going to show you the average impacts across those last 3 survey waves, which go up to more than 4 years after the interventions have actually ended. Okay, let's just talk what happens in terms of their first job. So when we look at in terms of how long does it take them to find a job? Okay, relative to the control group, for whom it takes about 12 months for them to find their first regular job. Both types of skilled workers, with or without the matching, find a job 1 or 2 months more quickly. That skills allow them to match more quickly. They're much more likely to find a job in a good sector relative to the control group. And there are no differences in terms of the time that they find a job and whether they find a job in a good sector or not. Okay, but in terms of their first job, we do start to pick up this bifurcation in outcomes already in their first job. In particular, for vocational trainees in their first job, they're much more likely to match with a firm that gives them a formal contract relative to workers who are equally skilled, but in addition, we gave them this match offer treatment. That's feeding through in terms of like the firm's quality, in terms of the first job that these workers receive. Vocational trainees without the match offer have significantly higher earnings than similarly skilled workers who are additionally given the match offer. This is very much in line with what I just showed you in terms of their short-run changes in strategy, that vocational trainees relative to those additionally provided matching are searching for higher quality firms, and in actuality, they're matching with higher quality firms in their first job. What happens over the long run, there's a whole sort of battery of different long-run labor market outcomes here. Here I'm focusing just on the employment margin. You can look at whichever outcome you like. We kind of summarize them in terms of this overall index of employment, where we're finding on average in the long run, those workers who were offered vocational training, their overall employment index rises by about 0.34 relative to the control group. Those workers who are equally skilled, but we additionally, with the intention of helping them through this match offer, they do much better than the control group, but there's a significant wedge that persists in their employment index between them and similarly skilled workers who weren't given the match offer treatment. That this short-run change in their expectations and search behavior is feeding through into their long-run employment outcomes. What's driving those differences? It's that workers who have been exposed to vocational training with the matching spend less time doing regular work, and they spend less months of the year engaged in regular work. They do find regular work, but when they do, their employment spells are going to be slightly shorter. Again, consistent with them sort of matching with lower quality firms within those sectors. So that's in terms of their employment outcomes. When we look at, when we look at their earnings are, just in the long run, below those of workers who had just been assigned vocational training. As I mentioned before, their unemployment spells are longer than those who are just assigned to vocational training. Their employment spells are shorter than those just assigned to vocational training. Again, consistent with them being matched to lower quality firms, even if those firms are in these good sectors. So both types of workers are transitioning up the job ladder. They're both making this transformation from a reliance on casual work to regular employment. It's just that transition's taking place more slowly for the vocational trainees that were additionally offered the match offer. The reason for that is that they changed their beliefs slightly, they changed their search strategy slightly. That caused them to get a worse first job, and that has persistent impacts on their subsequent labor market outcomes. We can look at the firm quality very directly by looking at the characteristics of the actual job that they end up in and the actual quality of the firm that they end up in. And again, it kind of reinforces the earlier narrative that those individuals who are equally skilled, but given the match offer, end up in worse jobs in worse firms. Okay, and that's the reason why their transition is slightly slower. They are finding employment on the extensive margin, but when we're looking at the degree of sorting in the labor market, they're sorting to worse quality firms, worse quality jobs. That's causing their employment status to be worse in terms of the length of employment spells. There's more churn for them in the labor market. They're still doing better than the control group, but they're not progressing up the job ladder as fast as skilled workers who weren't provided any kind of signal or information from the match offer treatments. Okay, so that's essentially, we're seeing long run persistence of this very short run light touch match offer amongst groups of workers who are skilled. There's a bifurcation in their beliefs, their search behaviors, their long run outcomes as a result. Okay, if we summarize everything just in one metric, constructing an index of all of those margins that I've shown you, employment, earnings, and spells, we get sort of one headline sort of index of labor market success. We see that relative to the control group, vocational trainees improve on this index of success, is standard normal, by about 0.12. That's the effect size impact for them. About half of the effect of skills is undone for workers who are actually equally skilled, but happen to receive this negative signal at the point when they were first transitioning into the labor market. About half of the effect of giving these workers skills is undone by this one piece of bad news, which is particularly salient to them, but hits them exactly as they're transitioning into the labor market. There's sort of one headline number I'd like you to take away from the paper. It's that one, that matching generates bad news given the over-optimism amongst skilled workers. And that causes short-run changes in beliefs and search behaviors that leads to long-run changes in labor market outcomes that undoes about half of the effects of skills. That's a pretty dramatic impact of just a sort of a very light touch information type of treatment. It's essentially what we're seeing here is scarring. It's kind of similar to the literature on scarring when workers who enter the labor market in good or bad times take a long time to catch up to workers who enter in sort of a boom period. By providing the match offer treatment, when that generates bad news for the typical skilled worker, it's causing them to be scarred, and it might take them a long time to catch up to the workers who just went into the market with very exuberant beliefs to begin with. I'm going to skip over the sort of the next set of results, which decomposes the impacts between skills and expectations. Let me just come to the last couple of slides just to conclude what we learned. So, kind of shown right from the start that labor market entrants, young people when they're first entering the labor market with sort of very short labor market histories, have very biased beliefs. They have biased beliefs in particular on one margin, which is the job offer arrival rate. They actually have pretty good beliefs about the wage offer distribution, but they're very over optimistic about the likelihood that they're going to receive a good job offer. They learn that, but only very slowly. When we look at what happens to the beliefs of workers when we provide them training, they become even more optimistic. Their beliefs revise upwards, but even further than they should do, so that essentially we're always comparing a group of very euphoric trainees versus increasingly realistic unskilled workers. And so a natural question to ask is, as policymakers, should we try to tell workers the truth? Should we try to de-bias their beliefs? And here we're arguing there are good returns for workers being exuberant here. When you try to de-bias workers' beliefs, say through the match offer treatment, that can easily backfire if workers misattribute the lack of callbacks as saying something very personal about themselves, cause them to change their behaviors that then has persistent impacts on them. If we're going to try to de-bias workers and think there are returns to workers knowing the true statistics out there in the labor market, we need to be very careful in how we present this information and make sure it's interpreted correctly. Absent being able to do that, there may be very, very high returns for workers searching with exuberant beliefs. The opposite is true for the match offer workers. I haven't spoken about them at all, but when we try to, for the match offer workers, what happens is for those unskilled workers, those workers who are randomized out of the offer of vocational training, when we hit them with the match offer, we're essentially confirming to them that they're not going to find a job unless they do something. The actual rate of callbacks was 19%. They expected it to be about 15%. For them, it's essentially telling them through a credible signal, you better do something. What do? They don't change their beliefs. What they do is they go to the credit market to borrow small amounts of money to set up in self-employment. 6 years later, they're significantly more likely to set up in self-employment. It may be the case that trying to de-bias workers who are particularly low skilled is effective. The interaction between skills and de-biasing is where we run into problems here, that it may backfire for more skilled workers, especially when you try to de-bias workers just when they're most euphoric at the point of graduating from the vocational training institute. For unskilled workers, the match offer treatments actually kickstart them into going to the credit market, borrowing, setting up in self-employment, doing better than the control group. So in that sense, the cost effectiveness of giving them this type of match offer is more effective than trying to provide them microfinance. They don't need small amounts of credit. They can get that themselves. What kickstarts them doing that, though, is confirmation that they're not going to do well otherwise. And so the question we started out with is, how do workers search for jobs in urban labor markets? We provided sort of long run and sort of very granular evidence along this sort of chain of this causal chain, from having experimental interventions, shifting their expectations, changing how they're actually searching for jobs, and that having persistent, irreversible impacts on their long-run labor market outcomes, not so much in terms of where they're finding jobs, but the types of jobs, the types of firms that they're matching with. Bad news leads to differential sorting amongst two groups of workers who are otherwise equally skilled initially. And so that has very important implications for how we both design and target otherwise standard labor market interventions related to skills and related to matching workers to firms. Okay, I'm going to shut up there.
Thanks so much, Imran. There has been a somewhat active debate in the chat, but I figured I let you finish and have people ask questions, the remaining questions orally. So anybody who wants to raise their hands, please go ahead. And David Margolis in particular, I'm aware of the fact that I skipped some of your questions, so do please come in if you want to. But Dave Bernard is first. You should unmute yourself, Dave.
Yeah, I've done that. Hi. Hi, Imran, thanks. It was a really interesting presentation. I guess I'm confused about why they're only over-optimistic about employment and not wages. Doesn't seem like something I would have predicted ex ante, and I don't really have a sense of why this is the case.
So on that, I mean, so the wage, you're right, that they have biased beliefs on one margin, perhaps because they receive much less frequent signals of that than on the wage offer distribution. If I know somebody who's employed in one of these firms, perhaps it's more easy for me to form those beliefs relative to the other margin. There is some other work from US job seekers as well that also seems to suggest that it's on the job offer arrival rate that individuals are biased relative to the wage offer distribution. But we don't have good micro-founded evidence on what's driving the formation of these beliefs. When we look at cross-sectionally, can we actually predict what these beliefs are? There's very few characteristics that can predict these beliefs. Some, if workers have had one of these jobs before, that leads their beliefs to be slightly more, accurate than otherwise. But that happens so infrequently that does not explaining too much in the cross section. So where these beliefs come from, I still think is a completely unanswered question from our intervention. What we can say is how those beliefs change with the provision of these types of interventions.
Thank you. Louise Fox, go ahead.
Yes, hello there. Good morning from San Francisco. Imran, this was really interesting. And I think this work about expectations is really important because many of us have often bemoaned some of the expectations. But I do have two takeaways from this work that I like your comments on. First of all, vocational training may not be worth it given the chances of finding a regular job. I mean, given the probability of the job times the increase in earnings, maybe it's not worth it. So that's one question. And also the narrative is that employers have trouble finding employees, but I haven't seen much confirmation of that narrative. It looks like employers don't have trouble finding employees since there were not vacancies 7 months later. And I'd like your comment, please. Thank you.
Okay, so on that first point, in our earlier work using data from this project, we calculated the internal rate of return to vocational training here. It's between 12 and 20%, depending on the assumptions that you want to make. It's not the most ever effective, development intervention that we can think of, but it has a pretty high internal rate of return. It does pay for itself in the long run. In terms of search frictions between workers and firms, you're absolutely right that firms have no difficulty in finding workers in this economy. There's typically long queues of people going to these firms. You can think of it sort of a model of job queues of unemployment here. And that's what we kind of misunderstood from our earlier work. We thought that because the match offer rates were so low, that firms have no difficulty finding workers. That's true, but what we didn't appreciate until we started working on this paper is that that has hugely important impacts in how workers form their expectations and subsequently revise their beliefs. So up until we wrote this paper, we thought the null was actually true, that there's no reason for a worker to become encouraged or discouraged from one particular piece of news from one particular firm. That turns out not to be the case. So although there aren't hugely important search frictions from the firm's perspective, these lack of callbacks do have first order impacts on workers.
Great, thank you. David Margolis?
Yeah, so I had questions about the beliefs. First of all, do you ask the people whether or not they have different beliefs about offer arrival rates if they have the training versus if they don't have the training? And when you compare to the actual, to see whether they're overestimating or underestimating, do you measure the reference group, whether they have training or not? Do you compare whether or not people have training and comparing them to whether they actually have training, what they should have their beliefs to be?
Yeah, so the answer to both your questions, David, is yes. So when I showed you the treatment impacts on beliefs on any margin, say for vocational trainees, that was relative to the control group. So for all of the treatment arms, we're asking these beliefs. And so you're seeing how much of those beliefs change. And at the foot of the table, we report the levels of those beliefs amongst the control group, those who haven't received any offer of vocational training. And when we try to benchmark this against what should be the truth, that's where we're using this nationally representative household survey, where we're taking a comparable sample of young people to say what are the actual rates of job finding, what are the actual wages of young people in these good sectors in the Ugandan economy as a whole, to get a benchmark of whether they're optimistic and the degree to which that's the case on both those margins.
But in the survey, do you distinguish between the trainees in the representative survey and the non-trainees in the representative survey?
Yes, we do. There are questions in there that ask about worker skills. So we try to match that up as closely as we can to what would correspond to having attended a vocational training institute.
Okay, thanks.
Rajesh?
Yeah, hi Imran, thanks so much for the talk. So just more like a curiosity, because I guess your design's not geared to test this, but just thinking about it correlationally within the pure control group, people who have much more positive expectations, what do you observe for them in the data? Are they much more likely to end up with jobs in the long run, or how does it look? Or have you ever looked at this correlation within your control group, that more motivated people who have this optimistic spin on the world search harder and end up in a better state of the world?
So I don't know the answer to that offhand, Rajesh. The closest thing we've done to that is amongst the group of vocational trainees, do we find that their beliefs correlate to the degree of skills acquisition that they've got? So there you find the workers who do better on the skills test have a bigger upwards revision in their belief. But I don't remember the answer in the control group.
Thank you.
I think Louis' hand was still up, but she just took it down. So I just want to make follow up. So I think with that, unless one of the panelists has a further question, no, we are just in time. Imran will be is available for further discussions in the Zoom room that was that Gianmarco shared the link of, and should be there in I guess in a minute or so, as soon as the room has been opened. Imran, thank you so much for this inspiring talk. We have a little bit of a team going on in VDEV about longer term studies, and this is another great example of how we learn, a lot of things we didn't know yet by following over the longer term and then getting some of these surprising results. So thanks a lot for that. In 2 weeks, we have Chris Woodruff, so we stick to the UK for once, and looking forward to see you all back. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Imran. Imran, you have the link to the other room?
I'm not sure if I do.
It is.
I posted it in the chat.
Let me get that.
There's the last message there.
Okay, perfect. I would just go there right now then.
Thanks so much.
Right.
Imran.
Got it.
Thank you
Okay,
so much.
cool.
Awesome
All right.
paper.